Stop. What the hell are you doing? I'm screaming at the top of my lungs at 6:17 in the morning, barefoot on the cold asphalt, and still in my wrinkled pajamas, bolting down the driveway, as our HOA president, Evelyn Vance, slams a heavy steel crowbar into the windshield of my visitor's truck. And the sound is something I'll never forget, that sickening, crystalline crunch followed by the spray of glass shards reflecting the sunrise like diamonds. She whips around, her pristine white tennis skirt smeared with a streak of engine oil, and she doesn't in oppos. To even look guilty, she just snaps at me that this junk is tanking our property values before driving the tip of the bar into the side mirror, snapping it off like a dry twig. I'm standing there, chest heaving, telling her that's not my truck and she needs to stop right now, but she doesn't into oppos. T care who's in quote, trash in quote. It is she just turns back and start carving the words in quote, move out in quote, deep into the door panels, the metal screeching like nails on a chalkboard while neighbors in oppos. Doors start cracking open and phones come out to record the madness. 8 years of this woman and oppos. As petty rules, her fines, and her towing tantrums had finally led to this, a literal felony caught on camera, and the best part was that Evelyn had no clue whose life she was actually destroying until I finally stepped close enough to whisper the truth in her ear. And she froze mid-swing, the crowbar dangling, all the color draining from her face as she realized she hadn't an oppos. T just attacked a neighbor. She had just declared war on the most dangerous person she could have picked. But let me back up a bit and tell you how we got to this explosion of suburban violence, because this wasn't an oppos. T just a random act of vandalism. It was the inevitable end of a long, dark road of corruption in the heart of Fairwood Estates. My name's Jackson Miller, and about 2 years ago, I bought what I thought was my little slice of quiet after a divorce that basically left me financially and emotionally gutted. I needed a fresh start, somewhere with manicured lawns and friendly families where the only drama was who had the best Christmas lights. And at first, Fairwood looked perfect. The dues were $315 a month, which felt steep, but the neighborhood was spotless, and I figured you get what you pay for. What I didn't in oppos, T realized, was that I wasn't in oppos. T buying a home, I was buying a seat in a private theater where Evelyn Vance was the director, the lead actress, and the executioner. Evelyn was late 50s with that specific shade of salon blonde hair that always looked a little too stiff, and she had this cloying, expensive perfume that announced her presence 3 houses away, a scent that eventually became the neighborhood and oppos. As warning signal to shut your blinds and stay quiet. She was married to a retired police captain, a detail she dropped into every single conversation like a verbal hand grenade just to remind you who held the power around here. The first time I really felt her sting was only 3 weeks after I moved in. I just finished a brutal double shift at the hospital. I work on high-end surgical lasers, so my brain was fried, and I came home to find a bright orange violation notice stuck to my front door. It was a $175 fine for, in quote, non-compliant mailbox hardware, in quote, which sent me spinning because I'd looked at every other mailbox on the street, and they were all identical. When I called Evelyn to ask for a clarification, she used that condescending tone people usually reserve for toddlers or golden retrievers, telling me that while the shape was correct, my screws were galvanized steel instead of brass-coated, as per Section 8.4 of the aesthetic bylaws. I remember sitting there looking at my bank account, feeling the injustice sitting in the back of my throat like a bitter pill, but I told myself to just play nice, pay the fine, and stay under the radar. That was my first mistake, because in a neighborhood like Fairwood, being a, in quote, nice guy in quote, is just blood in the water for people like Evelyn. As the months rolled by, I started noticing the patterns. Evelyn had a system. She didn't in oppos. T just harass everyone. She targeted the people who looked like they wooed in oppos. T, or couldn't in oppos. T, fight back. There was Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow who got fined because her, and quote, flower beds were too chaotic, end quote, which was Evelyn's code for saying she didn't into oppos. T like the wild sunflowers the poor woman grew in memory of her husband. Then there was the Ramirez family down the street, who seemed to get a trash can violation every single Tuesday. Even though their bins were tucked away better than anyone else's, it started feeling less like a homeowners association and more like a country club with a, end quote, members only, end quote, sign that only applied to people Evelyn liked. And the weirdest part was that while she was squeezing us for every dime, the end quote, approving quote, vendors for our repairs were always the same three companies, and their prices were easily double the market rate. I remember seeing the landscape crew, run by a guy named Brett who happened to be Evelyn's nephew, blowing leaves onto people's porches and then billing the HOA for, end quote, premium maintenance, end quote. Then about 9 months ago, I met Sarah. Sarah was a breath of fresh air in my otherwise gray life. Sharp, funny, and she didn't in oppos. Take care that I usually smelled like ozone and machine oil when I got off work. We met at a little dive bar downtown, and she mentioned she worked for the county, doing, end quote, compliance and oversight, end quote, which I assumed meant she looked at building permits or something. Our relationship grew fast, and she started staying over a few nights a week, usually parking her black Ford F-150 in my driveway. Now, in Evelyn's world, a woman driving a pickup truck was a sign of, end quote, declining standards, end quote, and the moment that truck started appearing regularly, the target on my back grew 100 times larger. The first shot was a, end quote, new guest policy, end quote, that appeared in our mailboxes on a Friday afternoon, stating that any guest vehicle parked for more than 48 hours in a rolling month will be fined $100 per day. It was so obviously directed at me that it felt like a slap in the face. I showed the notice to Sarah over dinner, and she just got this look in her eyes, this very calm, very cold, analytical focus. And she asked if the board had voted on this in a public session. I told her I had no idea. I didn't in oppos to even know when the board met because the notices were always posted after the fact. Sarah just smiled, a small, dangerous smile, and told me that in our state, an HOA can't oppos. T just invent rules on the fly without a quorum and a recorded vote. That was the first time I realized Sarah knew a lot more about the law than she was letting on. She encouraged me to start doing some, end quote, reconnaissance, end quote. And so, I became the neighborhood ghost. I go for walks at 5 a.m. with my coffee, documenting every single car in every driveway. I found that Evelyn's own son had his boat parked on the street for a week, 0 fines. The treasurer in oppos. S. daughter had a guest staying for 10 days, 0 fines. But the moment Sarah's truck hit the 49-hour mark, there was Evelyn, clipboard in hand, snapping photos like she was a forensic investigator at a murder scene. The tension finally snapped when Evelyn sent me a bill for $1,200 in, end quote, accumulated guest violations, end quote, and threatened to put a lien on my house. I was furious, but instead of screaming, I did what Sarah suggested. I requested the last 5 years of financial audits and meeting minutes, which is a legal right for any homeowner. The pushback was immediate. Evelyn told me the records were, end quote, in transition, end quote, and that I was being, end quote, unreasonably litigious, end quote, which is a fancy way of saying she was terrified. But luck has a funny way of finding you when you and oppos. Were you looking for it? The HOA secretary, an older lady named Martha who was clearly tired of Evelyn's bullying, end quote, accidentally, end quote, CC'd me on a thread where Evelyn was laughing about how she was going to, end quote, find that laser fixer guy into foreclosure, end quote, so she could buy the house for her nephew at a discount. I felt the ground shift under my feet. This wasn't an oppos. Just about mailboxes anymore. This was a criminal conspiracy. I spent the next month working 2 jobs, my actual job and my new job as a private eye. I found out that the $315 we were paying every month was being funneled into a series of shell companies that all led back to Evelyn's husband's, end quote, consulting firm, end quote. We were literally paying for her lifestyle, her designer suits, her country club membership, all of it. And the more I dug, the more I realized that she had been illegally raising the dues for years, ignoring the 3% cap written into our original 1994 charter. The actual legal dues should have been $140, not $315. We're talking about millions of dollars stolen from our neighbors over the last decade. When I showed Sarah the spreadsheets I'd built, she didn't in oppos to even look surprised. She just looked at me and said, end quote, Jackson, it's time to call a town hall, but Don and oppos. Tell Evelyn what it's actually about. Tell her it's A and oppos. Community beautification and oppos. Meeting, and quote. The day of the meeting, The community center was packed. People were tired, they were angry, but they were also scared. Evelyn walked in like she owned the air we breathe, wearing a navy blazer and holding her gavel like a scepter. She started the meeting by trying to publicly shame me, telling everyone that I was a, quote, non-compliant resident, end quote, who was trying to tear the community apart with, end quote, baseless accusations, end quote. She actually looked at me from the podium and said, end quote, Mr. Miller, if you can't oppose, afford to live in a high-standard neighborhood, perhaps you should find a trailer park that suits your budget, end quote. The room went silent, and I could feel the heat rising in my neck. I just stood up, walked to the front, and plugged my laptop into the projector. I didn't oppose, say a word. I just started scrolling through the bank statements, the emails about foreclosing on me, and the photos of her own family's violations. The gasps in the room were like a physical wave. Mrs. Gable started crying when she realized her $500 fine for sunflowers had gone toward Evelyn's new backyard pool. Evelyn lost it. She started screaming that the documents were faked, that I was a hacker, that her husband was a police captain and he'd have me in handcuffs by morning. But then Sarah stood up from the back of the room. She didn't oppose. She just walked down the center aisle, and for the first time, I saw her in her work clothes, a sharp, charcoal suit with a badge pinned to her belt. She looked Evelyn dead in the eye and said, end quote, actually, Evelyn, I'm the district attorney for this county, and we've been monitoring your HOA bank accounts for 90 days, end quote. The silence that followed was so thick you couldn't oppose. Have cut it with a saw. Evelyn's face went through 4 different colors of gray. She tried to speak, but only a small, strangled sound came out. Sarah continued, end quote, and since you decided to use a crowbar on my truck this morning, a vehicle that is technically registered as county property, I think we can add an oppose, destruction of government assets and oppose, to the racketeering and embezzlement charges, end quote. That morning in the driveway, the scene I told you about at the start, that was Evelyn's final unhinged, end quote, Hail Mary, end quote. She thought if she could just destroy the truck, she could destroy the person she thought was, end quote, just a girlfriend, end quote, and intimidate me into silence. She had no idea she was attacking the very person who held her entire future in her hands. As the police, real police, not her husband's friends, pulled into the community center parking lot to take her away, the neighbors didn't oppose, cheer. They just watched in this heavy, somber silence as the woman who had dictated their lives for 8 years was folded into the back of a patrol car. It was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen, but also the saddest, seeing how much damage one person's greed could do to a whole street of good people. The fallout was massive. The entire board resigned within 48 hours. We found out that Evelyn had stolen nearly $2.4 million over her tenure. Because of the RICO statutes Sarah's office used, we were able to seize Evelyn's house and her husband's, end quote, consulting, end quote, assets to start a restitution fund. Every homeowner in Fairwood got a check for nearly $9,000, and our dues dropped to $110 a month overnight. My mailbox still has the galvanized screws, and every time I look at them, I smile. Sarah and I are still together, and yeah, she still drives that black truck, though the county had to replace the door after Evelyn's little, end quote, art project, end quote. The neighborhood feels different now. The fences are still there, but the walls are gone. People actually talk to each other. Mrs. Gable's sunflowers are 6 feet tall, and there's no cloying perfume lingering in the air. What makes you think doesn't an oppose, it? How many people out there are living under a, end quote, mini dictator, end quote, just because they an oppose, too afraid to look at the books or stand up to a bully with a clipboard? We like to think our homes are our castles, but if you and oppose, in an HOA, you and oppose, really just a tenant in someone else's ego trip unless you stay vigilant. So, I have to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with a, end quote, neighborhood tyrant, end quote, who thought they were above the law? Did you fight back? Or did you just pay the fine to keep the peace? And do you think the punishment Evelyn got, 5 years of probation and total asset forfeiture, was enough? Or should she have spent real time behind bars for what she stole from those families? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I'm still processing how close I came to losing everything just because I had the wrong screws in my mailbox. And if you and Oppos, you got a story that tops this one, I'd love to hear it. But for now, I'm just going to enjoy the view of my unauthorized native grass and the fact that the only person patrolling my street tonight is someone I actually invited.